The men of the city, young and old, all the people, to the last man. When the Bible speaks about the people of a city in collective terms, it's usually understood that it's describing masses of people, maybe even a majority of people, but not literally and comprehensively every single individual of a city. When 2 Samuel 15:3 says that the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom, that doesn't mean every single individual in Israel was loyal to Absalom, because there was still a remnant of Israelites faithful to King David. When Mark chapter 1 verse 5 says that all of Judea and Jerusalem were baptized in the Jordan, we clearly understand that's just hyperbolic. Certainly, masses were being baptized, but not the mathematical totality of the inhabitants of Judea were wanting to be baptized by John. But this story in Genesis 19 is different. It's not just being hyperbolic. And when you take that seriously, the story becomes much darker than what had been thought before. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. The story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most horrifying episodes in the Bible. Here, the angels are probably expecting the worst, but are pleasantly surprised to be greeted by a man who simply wants to offer them hospitality. At first, they feel distracted from their mission, but eventually decide, if this is the first person they've met in the city and he's already offering them food and shelter for the night, then perhaps the intel reports they've been receiving were not as accurate as they had thought. So they indulge Lot's request. Everyone in this story so far seems uneasy, untrusting. The angels have their suspicions, but Lot is the only one who knows the danger that is in store for them. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than we will with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men, that is the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. 2 Peter describes Lot as a righteous man because he was tormented in his soul by the evils that were occurring in the city. And it's true that Lot was tormented, and it's true that Lot wanted to protect what he thought to be mere strangers entering into the city. There's a suspicion I have that he knew that they were angels because he bowed so too much to the ground to them, but I think Lot, as far as he knew they were strangers, and he wanted to provide them hospitality. But beyond that, it becomes difficult to see how Lot is righteous, considering he just offered his daughters to a feverish mob of wicked perverts. What Lot did here was wrong, but I wouldn't be telling you something you don't already know when I say that. Instead of telling you the obvious, I'd like you to try to see the reasoning going on in Lot's mind when he did offer his daughters, not as a justification, but as a rationalization. When a robber threatens people's lives with a gun to rob a bank, that is a heinous evil that cannot be justified morally. But everybody understands that there's a rationalization behind the robber's actions. If he's poor, if he's desperate, the actions of robbing a bank, as evil as they are, would, from a pragmatic standpoint, solve his predicament, at least in the short run. It's evil for sure, but it's not senseless evil. And in the same way, I want the listener to see Lot's unjustified rationale behind why he did that, because I don't think Lot was thinking about satiating the violent urges of a wicked mob. I think Lot was naive and aloof, but he was hopeful, desperate that things would go back to the way that they once were. Lot still had an affinity for this town, and he obviously got along with it enough to a degree that he had some affections for it. And those affections clouded his judgment. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting, to be mocking. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he, Lot, lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. Did you hear that? But Lot lingered. Why is Lot dragging his feet? I think the answer can easily be derived. As much as Lot was tormented by the wicked deeds that were going on in the city, he still developed an affection for this town and his community. And the whole time, Lot is in some kind of denial of what is actually happening, what's going on. Lot is in denial that the town is going to be destroyed. Lot is in some kind of denial that the mob really did want to go through with their rape campaign. I mean, Lot's Stockholm syndrome had gotten so strong for Sodom that he even had sons-in-law that were betrothed to be married to his own daughters. Did you catch that part? I don't know what you imagined when you heard that part of the story, but I think too many people are imagining the wrong thing. Lot didn't run through the city to find the residence of his sons-in-law, wake them up in the middle of the night to warn them, only to be thought of as joking around and then return to his house. That's not what the text says. If you haven't put it together yet, let me lay it out for you. At the beginning of the story, in verse 4, it says, "But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house." This is the only time in the Bible where such exhaustive, comprehensive, and collective intensifiers are stacked upon each other to this degree. It's mystified me for the longest time when I read it, till I realized the Bible isn't being just hyperbolic here. It's being literal. Every single man, down to the last man, surrounded Lot's house that night. And that means Lot's own sons-in-law were part of that mob. They were there. They were seeking the most wicked of intentions that night against the household of their own father-in-law and his household. Do you think I'm jumping to conclusions? Look at the wording the Bible uses in verse 4. Down to the last man. Doesn't it haunt you? Don't you see how far the text goes out of its way to emphasize over and over and over and over again that it's not just a generality we're talking about? Remember in the previous chapter the ominous conversation Abraham had with God, when Abraham reasoned with God to spare the city in case there was only 30 people who were not depraved and wicked. And God said he would spare the whole city for only 30 people. Yes, God will spare for 20. And then after 10, God says he'd spare the city for even 10. And the reader is left to wonder. Didn't you wonder when you read that story for the first time? Didn't you wonder, okay, God would spare it for 10 people, but would God spare it for 5? What about 4? 3? Or 2? Would God spare the city for even just one person? What if there is one single person in that city who is righteous? For a second, you feel silly to be asking this question because it's just a few people, but the question still persists in your mind. Let's just say there were 4 righteous people in that city. Would God destroy those 4 righteous people along with the rest of the city? And then you start asking yourself about what that means in terms of God's justice to be destroying 4 righteous people with the wicked. But the Bible doesn't leave you hanging. If you pay attention to the text, how many righteous people were in Sodom? Surely not all of them were wicked, right? Not all of them, right? Verse 4 says, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, surrounded the house. We get the answer to our persistent question. There were none righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. No, not one. And the only ones who were righteous were evacuated from the city. And the city was still not spared on account of them. When the angels told Lot to gather any family he had left, Lot didn't have to run across the town. He stepped right outside his house, nearby to the entrance, to look amongst the lumbering and confused masses and relocate where his sons-in-laws were. After he found them and warned them, verse 10 says, but to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. Another translation says he seemed to be jesting. But these aren't fully capturing what's happening here. The Hebrew word isn't just communicating joking around or being unserious. Too many people think this part of the story is that Lot is just being earnest, but his sons-in-law just think he's being capricious or silly. No. The Hebrew word is communicating scorn. The sons-in-law think that Lot is making fun of or scorning them. That scorn factor is another corroborative piece of evidence in the text that the sons-in-law were definitely part of the mob that night and not just fast asleep in their own private homes. Think about it. Lot finds them blinded and bewildered, probably crawling on the ground, and they're still just trying to understand what just happened to them. And then they hear Lot's voice out of nowhere, shouting down at them, saying, "Get up! Get out of this place! The Lord will destroy the city! Hurry up, let's go!" Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that sounds like to them in their ears? After their violent attempt was foisted, they have no idea how to interpret the events that just happened to them. All they know is that somehow, some way, Lot and his guests did this to them. And now, Lot has found them and is shouting at them while they are in this weakened and physically vulnerable state. Young's literal translation has the best translation of the word. It says, and Lot was as one mocking in the eyes of his sons-in-law. Mocking. They're confused at first, but then they begin thinking, oh, I get it now. Lot, you've bested us at the door, and now you're mocking us that you have the upper hand. You know we're blinded here and helpless, and you're telling us to get up and run, and it's an emergency, and you know that we can't. Well, the text here is explicitly telling the reader what's going on in the minds of the sons-in-law. It only implicitly tells the reader at this point what's going on in the mind of Lot. But you can imagine the war Lot is having with himself when the angels presented the opportunity for him to gather close loved ones and family for the escape. Lot's mind went straight to finding the very sons-in-law who only just moments before were trying to attack and rape him. What? This is what I mean when I say Lot is in denial. He's beside himself. He's at war with himself. He's saying the words of someone who knows the Lord is going to destroy the city, but his actions are of someone who doesn't really want things to change. He hasn't fully accepted what his own sons-in-law just did, what they overtly and violently revealed about themselves. He doesn't want to believe they are the wicked men that he just saw moments ago. He's telling them to come along with him, as if they didn't just try to rape his guests and do worse harm on Lot himself. Lot's mind is showing signs of brokenness even at this point. And then look back at verse 5. It says, and they called Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them to us that we may know them. Now, I hope the listener will indulge my reading in between the lines here. But when the Bible says that every single man was at that house that night, and then it says that they called out or said something, I don't imagine every single individual man saying together in perfect unison all of the responses in the back and forth that Lot had with them. No, I think it's perfectly reasonable that this crowd's intent was represented by some type of leader or leaders who were speaking on behalf of the crowd to Lot. And I think the best candidate for who that was were Lot's own son-in-laws. I can imagine them being right at the door and Lot meeting them. Verse 6 says, Lot went out to the men at the entrance. It makes sense to me that the crowd would let Lot's son-in-laws lead this charge, being that they knew Lot the best. But this is where I think Lot's mind begins its denialism. It's beginning to break. Can you imagine what Lot must be going through right now to see his own sons-in-law leading the rape mob charge against his own household? It's almost as if Lot himself couldn't quite fully believe it. He wouldn't let himself believe it. It was so wicked. I think when Lot witnessed what was actually unfolding before his eyes, that in a way it did begin to break his mind. He was having so much difficulty processing the situation that he never fully did, and I don't think he ever fully recovered from it. And I'll point to hints in the text of this, but this jolt to his psyche was so shattering that he couldn't even process the immediate, clear, and present danger right in front of his eyes, right in front of him. His cope was to continue seeing these two men as his sons-in-law and as legitimate husbands to his daughters. In my opinion, I think that was the motivation behind his appeal. His cope, his baffled response to the impending doom was to offer his daughters. But in his mind, he wasn't offering them to be gang raped, but he was offering them to the mob leader, sons-in-law, as a way to distract and de-escalate the two sons-in-law and hopefully by leverage get them to disperse of the crowd for the night. Lot just wanted to pretend that life can go on as it usually has. You can hear him making his plea in verse 7. I beg you, my kinsmen, do not act so wickedly. Hear, my kinsmen, make good on your betrothal to my daughters. Consummate your oaths to them. Assuage your lusts in consummation with your brides, and disperse of this crowd. Let's go back to the way things were. Don't go forward with this evil thinking you have. That's what he may be saying. Now, that doesn't mean Lot was not sinful in his request, even if you understand it this way. It's still evil, but his attempts to de-escalate the crowd might have been based on a plan geared towards his daughters consummating an already agreed upon betrothal they already had with the sons-in-law, and leveraging that to get the sons-in-law to get the crowd to just go home for the night. It's still a major problem because it wasn't based on the reality of the situation Lot was in. Lot was in denial. The problem was that Lot wanted things to go back to the way they were. He lingered. He dragged his feet when the angels told him to run quickly. He argued with the angels on getting permission to go to the town of Zoar, a much closer city to Sodom, rather than to go off to the hills. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh, no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me, and I die. Behold, this city's near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there, isn't it a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I'll grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there, quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. Look at what Lot is doing here. He's not ready. He's unprepared. At a time when the angels are giving him directions, his response is not to rise to the challenge. His response is to use flattery, to argue with the angels so that he can just go to the next town. He just wants this whole thing to be done so he can go back to the headspace of his regular schedule. It's almost autistic the way he's behaving here. Even in the middle of his plea, he describes the town of Zoar. He pauses to say, "See, it's a small town. Don't you think it's a small town? Yeah, it is a small town. Like, Lot, snap out of it. This is doomsday. You sound like you're beside yourself." But the angels grant Lot this favor because they were on a mission from God, and it was at God's direction to spare Lot on account of Abraham's intercession for Lot. So Lot is allowed to quickly run to Zoar with his family before the destruction ensues. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. With the mentality of Lot being settled in his mind to live permanently in Sodom, then how much more was his wife's? She had it almost worse because the text says she looked back. And I don't think this is merely a physical turning around to see, but I think this was a look of longing to go back to the way things were. And she's destroyed for it. Lot and his family escaped calamity, but they did not escape pain and hardship. And that pain and hardship all came because they were unprepared in their minds. They were not willing to adapt to the signs of the times. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Lot should be thanking God and thanking Abraham for his intercession because verse 29 says God saved Lot's life due to Abraham's words. But though Lot survived, he carried this trauma with him for the rest of his life. I think the text continues to hint at his broken mind, as it implies he developed a schizophrenia psychology in the town of Zoar. It says he feared the town of Zoar. And you can halfway understand why, after knowing now what he saw on that day when Sodom turned against him. You know it's a generally understood fear that people have regarding violent people who want to do you harm, who want to rob from you or even kill you. It's no secret that there is evil out there in the world, and its aim is to destroy us. But nothing prepares you for the moment when you realize that very evil targeting you is from your own loved ones, your own kin, your own household. That's the kind of frightening evil that always catches you off guard, leaves major trauma scars on your mind. I'm reminded of when Nathan the prophet declared unto King David the curse of having an evil entity rise up from within David's own family to destroy him and attack him. One of the most haunting things you can hear. But at least Nathan gave warning to David so David could mentally prepare for it. Lot, on the other hand, not only was unprepared, but also unable to adapt. He became so scared of everything in his schizophrenia that he took his daughters out into the hill country to live in the caves, like a Neanderthal. This whole time, his daughters watching him as a father figure, learning from his actions, seeing his behavior, and no doubt, it influencing them to have a moral character that is so depraved themselves, where in their frustration with their father's inability to lead or to adapt, they decide to take matters into their own hands to preserve their own line, collaborate to get their father drunk and bear children by him. Now, I'm not excusing the daughters' behavior, even though they had terrible example to grow up with. That doesn't mean that when they get old enough, they're unable to know right from wrong. All of us carry bad experiences with us from our youth, but it does no good to blame all of our hang-ups on our upbringing. It's not your fault what happened to you as a child, but it is your responsibility to heal from it as an adult. So these women are also responsible for the evil they perpetuate, regardless of how bad of an example they had. Now Lot went out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him. And he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus, both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. This is the very first actually recorded case in the Bible of rape. I know most people are distracted by and grossed out by the element of incest that this is. And they are right to notice that. But being that this is a series about rape in the Bible, I'm focusing in on the sexual assault factor of this encounter. Because before this, we had the threat of rape, but no actual rape occurred. The first time in the Bible that we see the crime of rape, it's perpetuated by women. They connived in secret among themselves to drug their father. Yes, drug him to the point of incapacitation, so that they could have their way with him and use him as they wanted to. Don't assume wine of the ancient days was like wine of the modern day, where each bottle has a very controlled amount of alcohol content. The Bible clearly states and repeats that Lot did not know when she lay down or when she arose, which is proof that Lot was effectively drugged. He was robbed of an ability to express consent or resistance to their advances or exercise any type of discernment. Now, Lot certainly failed to exercise discernment beforehand, but at least he had the freedom to express it. when his daughters connived a clear intent to incapacitate him, to take away whatever ability that he had left as a man with a broken mind to discern and decide, it became a premeditated case of rape. This means that men can and are raped, and not just by other men, but by women as well, as we see happening in this story. And I think we can safely say that all the lessons we learned from the principles of the last episode are justly applied to scenarios of rape and sexual assault cases where men are the victims and women are the perpetrators. My inclination is to believe that cases of women on men assault, sexual assault, are more rare than men on women sexual assault, but I wouldn't be so quick to think that they are much more rare. It's easier for me to believe that much of society just simply doesn't recognize it or decide to turn a blind eye to it, rather than call it what it is. And sure enough, I see the same thing happening in this passage. When many Christians cover it, they'll call out the evil of its incest, but I haven't heard anyone recognize it for the rape that it is. But to end this episode, I just wanted to say that this entire story of Sodom and Gomorrah is an absolute tragedy beyond Shakespearean proportions. The story doesn't go into detail after this about what happened to Lot, but you don't need to think very hard to understand how devastated he must have been when he found out the truth. Here's an old man at the end of his life. He's lost his homestead in Sodom. He's lost his wife. His own sons-in-law betrayed him, and he barely escaped. And this is all after Abraham already rescued him from kidnapping beforehand. And now he's developed schizophrenia and could never trust anyone ever again. He moved out of the town into a cave, and the only people he had left to trust were his own daughters. And now even they put onto him the very original fear that broke his mind in the first place, to be sexually betrayed by his own kin, by the people closest to him, confirming and making real the fears he carried for the rest of his life. Now, at the end of his life, it's still finding him and overtaking him. And being an old man, he no doubt passed away, at most some years later, with that as his legacy. And this curse continued on in his progeny by producing a people that would be thorns in the sides of Israel for the rest of biblical history. This story starts off chilling and ends off tragically. The level of tragedy, the likes of which make Edgar Allan Poe look like a children's author.